Okay, well thank you very much ladies and gentlemen for being here this afternoon. I'm Jo Gash, Mayor of the City, and I'd like to introduce some people to you. We have Councillor Alan Baptist, Assistant Deputy Mayor, who's at the back there. We have Councillor Tribe and we have Councillor Patricia White, and I'll introduce the guests in a moment. But I just want to say thank you for, welcome you to the Collingwood Beach June Vegetation, it's a long word isn't it, Management Public Forum and the Independent Expert Panel. And I'd like to introduce them to you. It's Gary Druid. Where are you, Gary? Gary has the overview of the whole situation over the last 40 years of development and dune works at Collingwood Beach. We have Professor Colin Wardrobe from the University of Wollongong, Coastal Processes. Hi. And we have Gabriel Petrini from the Offices of Environment and Heritage, an outline of the state government legislation related to coastal and dune vegetation management. That's what you're doing? Well, great. And we have council staff. We have Tim Fletcher, Director of Planning and Development. He hasn't got a tie on. We have Kelly Lowe, Environmental Services. Where are you, Kelly? And we have Penny Lum from the Coast and Estuaries Assistant. Where are you, Penny? She's right at the back. Oh, that's all right. Women are excused. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're here to listen to information from the expert panels, but most of all, we're going to listen to and document your opinions and ideas about vegetation management at Collingwood Beach. We're going to take the first steps to establish a reference group who will use the issues raised today as the starting point. We are looking for 6 people who represent various interest groups to be on the reference group. Council was undecided about including a summary of the Banner survey as it's non-consistent with the main purpose of today's forum. I emphasise that is not the purpose of today's forum. However, we have asked Cinnamon, and I'll introduce her in a moment, to provide a brief overview of the results, and the full report will be available on Council's website next week. So please note, we're not here to debate the issues or attempt to resolve anything. The panel's presentations will be videoed and placed on Council's website. I'd now like to introduce to you the facilitator is Cinnamon Dunsford. Where are you, Cinnamon? Now, Cinnamon is from Locale Consulting, which is a niche consulting firm that services local government clients. Cinnamon Dunsford is their principal planner, and she has been based on the South Coast for over 10 years. Cinnamon is a strategic planner with a strong background in community engagement, ranging from chairing of public meetings and large workshop facilitations down to coordinating specific focus groups and one-on-one local government legal mediation. Cinnamon is trained in facilitation and has been commissioned by Council to chair today's public meeting. Welcome to you, Cinnamon. You can take it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Joanna Gash. And once again, I know that we've already had a welcome, but I welcome you all here today too. I've conducted a lot of public meetings, chaired a lot of public meetings, and I still think it's great to see so many community members here on a Saturday afternoon. You know, there's lots of other things that you could all be doing, and I appreciate why you're all here today. So without further ado, we'll get this afternoon underway. A couple of, I suppose, caretaking matters. Can everybody hear me? Because it's fairly important that everyone can hear what we all have to say today, and that we'll all be able to hear you as well. Anyway, just briefly, I'm not expecting you to remember all these times. That's actually my job. We'll be here for 2.5 hours, and we've had a welcome and an intro. I'll just outline the agenda and parameters and purpose of today. Then we'll get on to our expert panel presentations. I'll just add that when our expert panel members undertake their presentations, at the end of each presentation there'll be a little time, 5 or so minutes, for some question and answers, because I know that in these situations, if you hear 3 different people speak and you're holding your questions, it can get a little bit laborious, I suppose, and you have to remember what you wanted to ask, etc. So at the end of each presentation, we'll take 2 or 3 questions for each of our presenters today. And if anyone would like pencils or paper or anything to write something down throughout the day when someone else is speaking, Penny up the back here has got pencils and paper. So if anyone would like some now, Penny's quite happy to hand it around. Otherwise, you know where it is if you need it. As the Mayor said, I'll also give a very brief summary of the Collingwood Beach survey findings, and then we'll move into the open forum, which is all about everybody here making comments, suggestions, opinions, ideas, putting them all forward. I'll be documenting every single thing that you say, and as the Mayor also mentioned, this is that start point to putting down all those issues so that the reference group can start looking at those issues once that reference group is formed. We'll have a review, and then we're aiming to close at 4:30. Before we go too much further, I find this to be a really important slide at any public meeting that I attend and that I chair or facilitate. I just ask that everyone have a look at the 4 points up here, because these are my parameters. I ask that everybody abides by these. You can't see. Ah, okay. Is it only the two of you that can't see, or are there other people that can't see the screen? Okay then. Can we make it any higher? Is that helping? Okay then. That's all right. And can everybody still hear me okay? All right, thanks. Very important that you can see what's here. Although I will run through what I'm saying, it's still nice to be able to see the screen as well. Okay, so number one, I ask that we allow each person to speak without interruption. Everybody will be given an opportunity. If somebody is, I suppose, running over time, then I will potentially ask that if you have covered your point, that we do move on to the next person, but I do ask that we allow each other to speak without interruption. I ask that we keep our discussion to the matter at hand and for us to be future focused. It's very easy to go off on tangents. It's something I do quite regularly myself, but it is my role today to try and keep people on the matter at hand. I also ask that we keep to the time frame so each person has an opportunity to input to the discussion, and I ask, most importantly, that we're constructive and respect each other. So does everybody feel comfortable abiding by these parameters today? Maybe it's best if I ask if anybody doesn't feel comfortable abiding by the parameters, because if at some stage throughout the day I do have to come back to these, I will. And now that everyone's agreed to these parameters, I will let you know that I'll keep my speaking to a minimum. I will treat each person equally, and I will report to Council transparently on any of the issues that are raised today. Now, I'll just run through these very briefly because I know that the Mayor has already been over these as well. It's the first step today in a process of establishing the reference group to develop recommendations which will guide the future management of dune vegetation at Collingwood Beach. Remember that it's the first step. We're not looking for the answers today, but we're looking to start a very important process. We will receive information from our 3-person expert panel. We will receive the outcomes of the Collingwood Beach survey, and we will hold an open forum to identify those key issues that the reference group will investigate. Today is all inclusive. It's about listening, and it's about taking down all the ideas. At the end of the forum, everyone is nominated or is invited to nominate themselves to be a member of the reference group. You can complete a form today, which Penny has at the back of the room. You can take a form with you because it is two-sided and you may like to fill it out at your own leisure, or you can complete the form online at Council's website. But all the forms need to be back to Council by Friday the 8th of August. Council's also asked me to mention that there is a related community engagement project. Council will be consulting with the community in the near future about other coastal zone management projects and works, including coastal erosion. So separate to what we're here to talk about today in relation to Collingwood Beach. This forms part of Council's coastal zone management plan and studies, and it's all part of an ongoing extensive consultation program, which is due to be rolled out in spring 2014. So in the near future, hence why I've been asked to mention it today. Kelly Lowe, I'll just hand over to Kelly now so that she can provide you with just a little bit more information on this. Thank you.
I just wanted to let you all know that councils will be coming in contact with you again as part of our coastal zone management plan. We've got a newsletter that we've produced that we'll send out to you because we're hoping to get you involved again with other processes that we've got coming up towards the end of the year in regard to coastal erosion. And it's all part of our draft coastal zone management plan. So that you'll get that website hopefully through your rates notice, that newsletter through your rates notice, or you can go onto Council's website. But we'll be in touch with you again in the near future about some of the other processes that you hear from our expert speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. So moving on with the agenda, I'd now like to introduce Gary Druid. He's an environmental consultant focusing on design and implementation of natural resource management projects. He has over 40 years' experience in soil conservation and the design and implementation of all sorts of natural resource management. Today, Gary will discuss the story of Collingwood Beach, from the first sign of dune erosion through rehabilitation programs and the future management. He's been involved in the past in a total restoration program with staff and management of the Soil Conservation Service of New South Wales and with Shoalhaven City Council. And so it's over to you, Gary.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Coastal management, there's a lot of different issues in coastal management compared to soil erosion in rural areas or catchment areas. Everything is based on vegetation growth and protection. It's much easier to control soil erosion on rural land with grasses and different types of vegetation than what it is on sand, because sand erodes very quickly and drifts. The vegetation within the sand dunes is very delicate, even though it's strong within its own pattern, and each species of vegetation in the dune system are protective of each other. The low-growing grasses on the frontal dunes, they're there to trap the sand when it blows up onto the beach. The midsection is lower-growing shrubs, which lift wind-blown sand, or elevates the wind so that sand can drop out on the frontal dune. And the hind dune area is for larger growth, again, lifting wind higher and higher above development, everything behind it, dropping sand on the beach. So it's there. What I'm going to do, before I go into a lot of stuff about Collingwood Beach, is just do a diagram on the board here so that you understand the vegetation patterns of a sand dune and what we call the sand cycle. Okay, so Collingwood Beach has been a part of that sort of thing. The vegetation was destroyed for development. Development took place, no vegetation followed. We got sand drift, inland onto roads, development, houses, so forth. And I'll go through quickly the background of how that was managed and what we've done on Collingwood Beach to date. Okay? The coastline, water, tidal zone. We come up the beach zone, incipient dune, secondary dune, usually a little swale, then enlarge and back off into development houses. Sand, total sand, grasses, spinifex, creepers, smaller shrubs like small acacia, rosemary, correa, those sorts of things. Back into this area here, and in the swales you have banksias, sheoaks, and back up here where you get over the back of this you get into the mahoganies and the gums. Okay? What we have, that's basically a sand dune profile, which is demonstrated here as well on this board, and where the positions of the vegetation groups are. On this board it shows and outlines the different vegetation. Okay? What we have then is a sand cycle. So we've got this is a stable dunal system, okay, this one. And we have a sand cycle, which basically cuts off there. So we've got the water, the beach zone, incipient dune, and back up here into this. This area here is the most important part of our sand dune. That part there. The more sand we can store in there, the more chance of all this back area has got to survive. So what happens? this sand here will keep accumulating. Just go back one step. I've worked all the way along the coastline from, or with a colleague of mine, Noel Kesby. We've worked right along the eastern coastline from Queensland to South Australia. And we've been involved in just about every eroding beach along that section. We don't get invited to look at the pretty ones, we get invited to look at the eroding ones. So we see the nasty one. Generally, all sand drift out of estuaries, rivers, any sand that's available on the coastline drifts north. Okay, so it goes in currents and heads north, and that's how we get places like Fraser Island, which is a total sand island. All the islands around the Barrier Reef are all sand islands that the sand from New South Wales and Victoria are transported up there. What happens in Jervis Bay, we get a little bit of sand that comes into Jervis Bay as it passes, and then other beaches that are on the lee side of that get sand as well. That sand accumulates in this incipient dune, we call it, or the spinifex dune, and that'll keep building as long as we've got this vegetation behind it to lift the winds up and drop it down in the front. What will happen in a storm event? This is so important. We have a storm event, we have huge waves coming, and they'll bite off a big hunk of that, take it back out into the ocean, and create an offshore bar. Depending on the duration and intensity of the storm event, is determined on how long this erosion phase will take and how much sand it'll take to form this offshore bar. When that offshore bar is full, these waves that are crashing here are broken up in that offshore bar there and then floating across the beach and come up here and just bubble and froth. You would have seen that happen. When that storm event disappears or is gone and we get back to settled conditions again, this sand that's in this offshore bar will gradually come back onshore and it'll start accumulating on that frontal dune there again. Spinifex creeps over, grabs it, and it'll keep growing, keep building and building and building back again, providing we've got this hind dune system to protect it. If you haven't got that, all this sand is going to keep drifting straight inland, and you know, it'll damage development, houses, roads, whatever's in its path, infrastructure. So it's most important to have a vegetated system back here, and it's a system where you just can't grow grasses because grasses won't hold enough sand. They'll only, spinifex for instance, will only grow to a height of about 200 or 300 millimetres. Once that's full of sand, caught in sand, the sand will keep drifting straight over it again. So this is so important. This looks a bit messy. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Okay. So this sand cycle is so important to our coastline that we keep all our sand in that area there for storm events to form that offshore bar, and that's what will protect the foreshore. What happened in the 60s, not only on Collingwood Beach, but hundreds of beaches along the eastern coastline, there was not a lot of legislation to do with coastal management. It was an unknown area. And most of the beaches, especially on the south coast, were like little fishing villages, and they just had small development in the hind dunes that didn't get any damage, so they weren't too much of a problem. When development started, like it did in Collingwood Beach, and two other beaches too, it's not just Collingwood Beach, the sand started to drift. So what happened, this is down about Susan Street, down towards Vincentian. This vegetation was starting to be cleared for development, okay, development of Collingwood Beach. There's a bulldozer in the 60s. Susan Street goes back through there. We've still got houses in the trees up there that are still there now. This is Collingwood Beach, okay? That was a vegetated sand dune. once the vegetation went off that sand dune, we got drift sand going onto the road, into houses, on the lawns. People were complaining that sand drift even got up under their roofs, onto their ceilings, and ceilings started to crack and fall in, and so forth. So at that time, there was so much of this sort of stuff happening along the coastline. Residents and councils and the Soil Conservation Service got together, and there was a system called the Coastal Hazards Program established, which allowed budgets to councils and community groups to do work on their sand dunes to stop this erosion. This is a part of Collingwood Beach. After the system started, after our revegetation system started. So you can see what I'm talking about, this sand being blocked in that frontal dune area. From time to time it has, in the 80s and 90s, and you would have seen it, that the beach has taken all that, just taken all that out that formed that offshore bubble. Spin effects is re-established again, the dunal system comes back. And it's in good shape at the moment, even though we've lost a bit of vegetation in places. Collingwood Beach, attracting heaps and heaps of people. So what we've got up here, this is the old photos I took back in the 70s. This is where the developments started in the background. Roads covered, sand drifting inland, escarpment right in front of the houses. This was initially stabilised with marram grass, which is not a native to Australia. And these days it's a sort of a scary thing when it's not a native plant. So, but in those times it was the only thing that we used as a primary stabiliser to stop sand drift going inland. It worked wonderful because you could plant shrubs in behind the clumps of marram grass and they generate and grow. So that's it back then, that's it now. So we've still got that spin effect, so we've got vegetation behind. That's it again today. And I took these photos just the other day of Collingwood Beach. So the Coastal Hazards Program budgeted money for all this to get going. Collingwood Beach, even though it wasn't called a dune care group, was one of the first dune care groups established in New South Wales. So the residents who were in these houses that was getting swamped with sand, they formed their own ratepayers group and lent a hand to revegetate all these dunes. There's probably still some around. Poor old fellas there were some older people that helped us do this work, and they worked their butts off, and they were pretty old, so they wouldn't be around today.
What is?
Oh yes, it is very old. All right. What happened after this initial works and everything? There's brochures and booklets printed on the Collingwood. Collingwood Beach was one of the, I suppose, what you'd call a highlight dune erosion area on the south coast. So it was one of the nastiest ones that happened, even though we had some bad ones. We didn't get a lot of this sand drift as bad as this going into houses. The North Coast lost a few houses in the 60s and 70s due to dunal erosion. Following all this, there was a few, pamphlets and booklets put out from the colleagues I work with, which was Peter Davies and Mel Kesby. One's called the Collingwood Beach Story, which is basically what I'm talking about now, and the other one is Collingwood Beach 10 years on. So it sort of talks about the 10 years after through the 80s and how it was established, how it was going. I'll show you a survey graph shortly before I close up. And here today we have a stable system in good condition which could withstand or will withstand major storm events. Even though Jervis Bay is pretty well protected from lots of coastal storms and influence, It's direct into the southeasters, which we get through the winter. So they're the ones that really flog our coastline. The nor'easters we get in summer are not so bad, unless you've got a northern facing beach like at Curra. The other one that cops a lot of damage in New South Wales, northern facing, is lost it. It's up the north coast, but it's northern facing, the same as Curra Beach, which cops all the summer erosion. We nearly always get winter erosion. So today we've got a stable system, and what we hope to do in the future on Collingwood Beach, this group that you establish, is what we've done here. We've reshaped this beach system here, had a conference, the same as what we're doing here, revegetated that area. The groups have come in with kids and everybody else and planted the system out. This beach here is actually Huskerson Beach in front of the caravan park. And this is a nursery that I managed to provide packages for coastal restoration. So what we did here was we'd get orders from eroding beaches all along the coastline, and we'd package them up and send them to that particular beach, and they'd carry out their program. So dune care groups, councils, national parks, whoever. I'll just show you a graph to demonstrate how this has worked. Might be a bit hard to see for a lot of people, but this is when we started the work on Collingwood Beach in the 70s. This one here is 74. So that's the fence, the protective fence along the back. That's the road and the development. We've got, that's the 5 metre mark, so we're about this line here is about 2 metres. And this is the erosion scar, when we got all that erosion. So it went out, about 5 metres, dropped straight off where the storms hit it, and then went 20 metres into the water. Okay, steep profile, nothing there to hold sand or protect anything, so we had erosion happening all the time, sand drift, and all that stuff. The survey in the booklet, 10 years on, it showed the beach line again, the beach profile in blue, goes out, it's got a nice lot of sand accumulated there, a swale, and out into the incipient dune here where the spinifex dune is, no spinifex dune here, and then down into the water, which is 40 metres out. Okay, so we've gone from basically 10 metres, 20 metres into the water, to 40 metres into the water. I took this survey just last week. Okay, so we go out, we've got the same amount of sand in here, we go out, a bit further, incipient dunes further out again. So we've got build up from there, right out here where we've got a huge bulk of sand ready for the next storm to come along. And because we've got vegetation back here, we're going to keep that sand in the cycle. Okay, so that, what we have actually done since the storm events and the erosion in the 70s, in the mid-70s to 2014, we've pushed sand back to the seaward 55 metres. Okay, so that graph proves the vegetation we've put in there is working.
Is that something I can hand around?
Yeah.
Yep. Is that okay? Because I realise there's probably people who couldn't see from up the back. I'll just start it up here and see if we can way around the room.
So, what I would take away from this meeting if I'm not on anybody's side here, I'm a bit passionate about erosion and fixing erosion. But what I would take away from here is making Collingwood Beach a strong dunal system and a nice place to live without erosion, okay? And that means forming this group that you're talking about. We can even, if it's a group that wants to get real enthusiastic, they can develop plants that they choose to put in the dunal system. So we can talk about all that, or the council or the chairman of their group can talk about that and select plants that will be suitable for that system and will work. So there's no sense just saying we're going to clear it all, because that won't work. You're just going to go back to this again.
So it's got to be managed in the proper way. Okay, so that's what I'd go away with saying. I'm going to think about managing Collingwood Beach the right way and still have it attractive. Okay?
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much. There's
Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce our next expert panel member, and that's Professor Colin Wardrobe. He's a coastal geomorphologist in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the Uni of Wollongong. He has a PhD and an SCD from the University of Cambridge, and he has written and co-authored lots of books on our coastline. Besides that, Colin has studied the development of coasts in Australia and New Zealand, as well as overseas, including the West Indies and the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So I'll now leave Colin to talk to you about the geomorphology of the Jervis Bay area. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cinnamon. My usual job is educating the next generation of coastal managers, academics, environmental consultants and so on, and try and explain the sort of things that Gary's had years and years of experience to usually a lecture theatre that's not as full as this, so thank you for coming here. I'd like to start by reinforcing some of the points that Gary said there. First of all, to indicate that each beach and dune along our coast is slightly different from the next one. There are various types. There's, for instance, in the Shoalhaven 7 Mile Beach, which consists of a whole series of former beach ridges, sequence of ridges, and it's quite an extensive coastal plain. There's Bowery Barrier right down here, which is an enormous dune. We call it a transgressive dune, but it's a dune that's 20, 25, 30 metres high. It's a very big dunal system. There are systems that are just a single dune, and there are systems that are a single dune, like here at Culburra, which seem to be receding, which seem to be eroding. So, and we also need to understand what we call coastal compartments that you can identify, and this is very nicely shown by Collingwood Beach, a beach between a couple of headlands. And some beaches are moving sand northwards with longshore drift, particularly those in northern New South Wales. Others are quite small pocket beaches, and some are directly aligned with the incoming swell, like Bowery Barrier. So we can think of these systems here and see that each of these systems is slightly different. 7 Mile Beach I mentioned, which is this broad plain with several ridges. The Shoalhaven River, of course, is an important supplier of sand, or has been, so that has contributed sand to the coast. Jervis Bay, by contrast, has no significant rivers bringing sand into the system, so it's got a finite amount of sand in it. This is a diagram that, again, Gary will be familiar with. It sits in the dune barrier there, but I want to get the difference between an erosional event, and what the system is doing in the longer term. So if we look through this line in the middle here, we've got a beach, we get one of those big storms that Gary talked about, we get a storm cut, the sand gets eroded off, moved into a nearshore bar, and over the subsequent weeks, months, perhaps years, sand moves back onto the system, and if the system is totally balanced, it'll be a stable system. But many systems are losing sand, and in that case, they're going through what we call shoreline recession. So the system again, the storm cuts, brings some sand back. We don't get the fore-dune reconstructed in the same point. There's some retreat of the coast, gradual retreat over the years, over the centuries. In some systems, where there's a supply of sand, the opposite can happen. You get the storm cut, but in this case, over time, there's more sand added, and eventually another ridge might be formed in some of those systems. So each system fits somewhere into these sort of different patterns of how it might behave. Then, of course, it's wave energy, which is so important for the erosional storm cut events. And this is just a diagram a student put together from the other day, indicating that there is wave energy that penetrates into Jervis Bay. It's a relatively sheltered location, but nevertheless, when you get those big events, as we know from what Gary's said, we do get erosion, particularly over here on this western side. And the western side of Collingwood Beach sits on the front of one of those barrier systems. It's covered by houses now, but suspect there are a series of subtle ridges through before you get into Moona Creek and the Moona Creek system. And so Gary's very competently covered, of course, the events in the 1970s. A couple of storms that in 1974, I wasn't here, some of you were, that cut back. Here's an example of what happened in Killala, where it cut 6 or 9 metres into some of the designated plots there. Collingwood Beach, so I read that half of the public reserve, about 30 metres wide, was eroded away. Gary's covered some of the recovery since then, and particularly the community efforts to replant. And I thought a particularly telling little quote came from that paper by Peter Davies about Collingwood Beach. In 1978, there was another fairly major storm, and it cut back. And at that stage, and Gary was probably involved in it, there had been revegetation of part of the system with marram grass, interestingly. And following that, here's a quote from what Peter Davies said. Debris left by wave action indicated that waves had penetrated about 10 metres into the shaped and planted area, that's the managed area. Damage to this area was negligible. However, the untreated section of beach suffered further erosion to a significant extent. So a very practical example, just recording back there when the next big storm in 78 occurred, the fact that there'd been some work to put that vegetation, the marram grass planting in particular, was already, that area suffered negligible erosion compared with the area that hadn't, that was still loose sand and eroded much further. So I'd like to, now in the case of New South Wales, we have a magnificent data set from down near Moruya, where there's a beach that has been studied systematically over 40 years now. And so it's the system underneath the Moruya airstrip, actually. This is a LiDAR image, airborne LiDAR, that can give us a really good picture of the topography. And it shows that there's a sequence of ridges, beach ridges, that have built up at that system there. This is, that's the beach. This is various surveys, like Gary talked about over the years. And this is a history of what's happened. And if you can see this, and sorry, some of you may not find a bit, this is 1974, the two big storms cut back, they cut about 200 cubic metres for every metre of beach face. So they cut the beach back very significantly. It recovered a little bit, and then here's that 1978 storm, again, that cut back. So this scarp that you can see now, or it's vegetated, but there's the remnants of that, where that beach cut back to in 1978. And since then, it's taken, well, nearly 10 years to build back to its same position. And since then, it's fluctuated. There have been some storms that have cut it back, but nothing as big as those 1974 storms. So this is one of our greatest insights into the way that beaches, particularly more open ocean beaches, behave along that coast. So what do we need to try and understand what's going to happen on a beach like Collingwood? Well, we would ideally try and estimate the sediment budget. Where is the sand and where is any additional sand coming from or going to? So the sand can, well, it could be eroded from the cliffs or it could be delivered by rivers. That isn't happening in Jervis Bay. So we're either interested in the exchange that's coming out of the bay itself onto the system, or that's the interchange between the dune. Now, this fore dune has been built on, so we've lost that source during storms of sand that can come back into the system. We could get some in situ production, but shell isn't particularly a major part of this beach sand. We're dealing with that finite amount of beach sand. We don't have a river bringing sand in. Moona Creek won't be bringing any sand in. It might actually be a sink for some sand. Sand might actually get moved into, I know it's at this end, but it might get moved into that system. So I have seen some questions about, is there a source of sand if we wanted to put more sand on the beach? Essentially, we don't know, but there's not many opportunities for more sand to come into the system in that system. I thought I'd just show you some results of research students involved with Killala Beach, not far away, of course. Again, there's a subtle system of beach ridges that makes up Killala Beach. So in the long term, it's gradually built out. we have been sampling that. Here's a survey across that shows very subtly, in fact, you can see that when you're in there, you can't actually see these ridges, but there are these subtle ridges, and this is an example of ground penetrating radar. So we've gone across here's the bay, here we come up over that little first 4 dune ridge, and this, we can pick up some of the indications of the former shape of beaches. And I suspect, with no way of really confirming, that this major feature is that scarp cut in 1974. So in Kalala, it's probably built this amount of sand up since then. So we're in a system where I should emphasise that we can expect again to see a storm at least as big as 1974, perhaps bigger. We can also anticipate that the sea is going to rise. I'm sure you want some real figures on that rate, and here's a somewhat controversial pattern that was produced a few years ago, indicating the sea was rising, but a sort of curve through it suggested that it wasn't rising any faster. But you can see that the trend, this is for Sydney and this is for Newcastle, has been going up. Still more recent evidence, Port Kembla, tight gauge, just down the road from me, indicating a pattern of sea level rise which is pretty consistent with what we think the global rate of sea level rise has been at the moment. So the sea appears to be rising pretty much a rate of 3 millimetres per year. That's going to exacerbate all of the coastal hazard problems that we have already. Here are the Ipcc projections for how the sea the best projection we can get for how it might respond in the future. It depends on particularly how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, but you may probably be aware that Council is going through with Europadala an exercise of revisiting what would be the most realistic projections for sea level rise in this region. It seems very unlikely it's going to differ from what the state government told us a few years ago, so we must anticipate that there will be a gradual rise of sea level, perhaps 0.5 metre by the end of the century. And that, of course, is just going to exacerbate the problems that are there. So if I can make 5 points, I guess, in summary of what I've said. But first of all, beaches are dynamic. You may think that in Jervis Bay we're a little bit more sheltered, but they still experience significant erosion, as we saw back in the 70s. Those large storms that occurred in the 70s, we will get, that we don't know what the recurrence interval of that is, or this is 1 in a 100-year storm, 1 in a 30-year storm, 1 in a 50-year storm, but a storm of that size will occur again. A bigger storm will occur at some stage, so we need to be aware of that. There's already infrastructure, of course, on these dunes and behind them that's already at risk, I think we'd have to say, within the terms of the hazards that we can envisage recurring. Sea level rise will exacerbate those hazards, and dune vegetation is one, I think, underestimated strategy in terms of adaptation, adapting to climate change, to sea level rise, to the hazards that are along this coast. Seawalls are another. I saw some report that was produced that would estimated the cost to put a seawall along Collingwood Beach, but I must say that I'm sure there's many people in the room here that would rather see a natural beach than one with solid protection. So that's my contribution. Thank you very much.
If anybody has any further questions of Colin, there will be opportunity later on to speak to Colin and the other 2 members of the expert panel. So I will just move on now to introducing our third and final presenter here today, and that's Gabrielle Catrini. Gabrielle's the Acting Manager of the Illawarra region of the Office of Environment and Heritage. When she's not acting in that regional manager role, Gabrielle is Senior Team Leader of Water, Floodplains and Coast. So she is responsible for the local delivery of the New South Wales Government's Coastal Management Program, and her team works closely with councils to implement sustainable management responses to coastal issues. Gabrielle's been involved in natural resource and coastal hazard management in the Shoalhaven for nearly 15 years, and she also spent 2 happy years living in a house on Collingwood Beach some years ago. So I welcome Gabrielle. Thank you.
Yes. Hello. I'm a bit shorter than the others. Thank you. So I'm not quite an expert in the scale of Gary or Colin, but I can talk to you about the legislation and how it relates to how we manage Collingwood Beach. So I'm aware that it's a bit of a dry topic, so I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. So I'll talk about the coastal zone management framework that we have and a little bit about how the New South Wales Government supports councils to implement management of the coastline within that framework, and then talk about a couple of issues related to how the framework's changing at the moment, and that's referred to as the Stage 1 and 2 coastal reforms. So in relation to legislation, there's a whole list of legislation that determines, you know, the framework in which council can make decisions when they're responding to issues at Collingwood Beach. Firstly, I guess the Coastal Protection Act, which was brought out in 1979 in response to all of those events that Gary was talking about with erosion up and down the coast. The Local Government Act affects how council can manage the land, also the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act and the Crown Land Act. And coincidentally, all of this legislation is being reviewed by the New South Wales Government at the moment. So we're in a bit of a space at the moment where there's a lot of consultation happening with councils about, you know, how that framework's working for them, and seeking input as the New South Wales Government reviews the framework that's there. Underneath the range of acts that are there, there's a whole lot of regulations, and the most relevant one being the Coastal Protection Regulations. And then once you've got that overriding framework, you've got a range of policies, including the New South Wales Coastal Policy, state environmental planning policies relating to coastal protection and infrastructure, a whole host of guidelines that various state government departments, Department of Planning and Environment and Office of Environment and Heritage have released. And within the Local Government Act, there's a section 733 which provides indemnity for local government if they operate in accordance with some of those guidelines that the state government has identified. So there's really quite a close relationship between the New South Wales Government and councils in managing these things. So rather than go through the whole list of, you know, acts and regulations and policies and all of that, I thought I'd just focus on the objectives of the Coastal Protection Act, because it really clarifies the whole range of issues that need to be considered when you're making management decisions, because all of the other bits of coastal protection legislation really hinge off that act. So the objects of the Coastal Protection Act are to provide for the protection of the coastal environment of the state for the benefit of both present and future generations. So I've just highlighted the important points, I think, there. So we have to protect the coastal environment, and we have to bear in mind it's for the whole population, and the population now and into the future. So underneath that first statement, there's a whole list of things, you know, in more detail. So we need to protect, enhance, maintain and restore the environment of the coastal region. And so that relates to ecosystems, ecological processes, biological diversity and water quality. So up front, we've got to consider all those environmental values. Then we also need to encourage, promote and secure the orderly and balanced utilisation and conservation of the coastal region and natural and man-made resources, while having regard to the principles of ecologically sustainable development. So there's an acknowledgement that the coast is there to be used, so we're looking at the orderly and balanced utilisation of the coast, as well as the conservation of the resources that are on the coastline. And ecologically sustainable development is a term that's commonly used in legislation to you know, give awareness that, you know, you need to consider the whole range of issues of environmental issues alongside social impacts and economic issues as well. So the next one is to recognise and foster the significant social and economic benefits to the state that result from a sustainable coastal environment. So that's acknowledging a whole range of things in relation to, you know, Shoalhaven has such a massive tourism industry that really hinges on the natural environments that you've got, including the coastline. So I think it's an acknowledgement of the economic value of having a sustainable coastline for also other industries that you have as well, but also the social side of it, and that includes cultural issues about, you know, the cultural connection people have with the coastline as well. We also need to promote public pedestrian access to the coastal region and recognise the public's right to access. So this is a really important one that comes into play in places where erosion's an issue, because we have property boundaries that are fixed lines, and then we have a coastline that's movable. And we have this legislative framework that says we need to preserve the public's right to access the coastline. So we actually have an obligation to try and maintain an area in front of private properties that is accessible to the public so that everyone can benefit from the coast. And to recognise the role of the community as a partner with government in resolving issues relating to the protection of the coastal environment. So that's a big push for the New South Wales government now, and has been for quite a long time, is really, you know, focusing on empowering local communities to input to the decision making, and where possible to make the decisions themselves. So forums such as this. And then to encourage and promote plans and strategies for adaptation in response to coastal climate change impacts, including projected sea level rise. So within the New South Wales government legislation, council's required to consider the potential impacts of sea level rise in any of their management decisions that they make. And then to promote beach amenities, so acknowledging that, you know, people want to be able to recreate on beaches. So to implement this legislation and to work within it, the New South Wales Government, through the Office of Environment and Heritage, provide a whole range of support to councils. We have the Coastal Management Program, which involves funding as well as technical assistance to councils, and that's the program under which some of the coastal and estuary natural resource and floodplain management committees, that's you might be familiar with, that Shoalhaven Council runs. They're partly you know, operating within the framework that we've set up to implement coastal management. Funding we have usually in the order of, you know, around $4 million a year to assist councils to do coastal management along the coast, and councils contribute dollar for dollar for those for that funding. We also collect a whole range of data that can be, that's applied information that councils need. So OEH has a science division that collects data about a whole range of environmental issues, but there's a dedicated coastal section of that, and they operate under a knowledge strategy that we input to by saying, you know, these are the questions that councils are facing, and this is the information they need to underpin their decisions. So we're actively trying to make sure that there's a science evidence basis for the work that we do on the coast. And MHL is the Manly Hydraulics Laboratory, which operates a whole suite of data collection programs, including, you know, things that measure water heights and waves and that sort of thing, to inform our management as well. So we've got the guidelines for preparing coastal zone management plans, and the Shoalhaven Coastal Zone Management Plan's been referred to a couple of times already today. That's in draft form at the moment. So the guidelines identify, you know, some minimum requirements for what the coastal zone management plans should address, and then it sort of just ensures, it provides a frame, it provides a sort of a skeleton of what you need to consider if you're going to do coastal zone management, and then councils can build on that according to their local needs and criteria there. We've also got the New South Wales Government Coastal Dune Management Manual, which, so the guidelines for the Coastal Zone Management Plan, that applies to like sort of Shire-wide coastal zone management plans. The Coastal Dune Management Manual is really a how-to guide once you get down to the level of something like Collingwood Beach. If you want to put fences in, if you want to put in vegetation and that sort of thing, it's sort of a best practice guide that was written by the state government following all of the work that Gary and others did through the sort of 70s and 80s and 90s, and it drew on all the lessons learned from that work, and Gary contributed to it, and it really was to encapsulate the best practice for doing dune revegetation and rehabilitation and protection. And councils are still using that today because it's still the best practice guide for that type of work. So I mentioned earlier that we have the current legislation, but a lot of the legislation's under review at the moment. So the Stage 1 coastal reforms happened a couple of years ago. The key elements involved amendments to the Act relating to temporary coastal protection works, which relate to, if there's a storm event and that sort of thing, to protect your properties from that. It included new guidelines that are to be prepared by the Department of Planning and Environment to clarify notations on Section 149 certificates, so about sea level rise potentially affecting properties. And they've been in draft form and been out for consultation. It abolished the New South Wales sea level rise policy statement, so it's been mentioned earlier as well. The state government previously had a sea level rise policy statement that identified projected sea level rises by 2050 and 2100, but there was a range of issues around how it was being applied that was proving problematic. But after the New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer did an assessment of the science behind the sea level rise planning benchmarks, which is what they were called, she found that the way that the science had been used to determine the benchmarks was adequate given the current level of knowledge. So the benchmarks were removed not because it wasn't based on sound science, but just because of practical implementation issues that were happening at the time. So some other issues in relation to Stage 1 coastal reforms. We undertook to develop a coastal hazard mapping guide, which we're working on at the moment. We carried out a business case for Independent Coastal Advice Centre and investigated whether that was a better option than providing the OEH technical advice. We deferred certification of coastal zone management plans until after the Stage 2 coastal reforms are complete. So the New South Wales Environment Minister can certify coastal zone management plans to give councils that indemnity under Section 733 that I mentioned earlier. But we're looking at that decision. We're reviewing whether we might start certification again. And we undertook to provide some fact sheets on the role of SES and councils during erosion events, and State Emergency Service is doing that. And we established the Coastal Ministerial Task Force and Coastal Expert Panel to contribute to the Stage 2 coastal reforms. So the Stage 2 coastal reforms are currently being worked on. The main aim with the Stage 2 coastal reforms is to integrate coastal natural resource and hazard management with the local government, Crown land and planning reviews that are underway. So the list of legislation that I had up at the start that is all being reviewed, it's such an opportunity for us to make sure that it all works in well together, and a lot of the management issues that you have on the coastline you could avoid by having effective planning up front. So that's the main reason that we're trying to review it in accordance with the planning legislation. We're looking at refining how coastal hazards are notated on Section 149 certificates to make sure it's relevant and accurate. We're looking to provide improved support to implement and fund coastal zone management plans. So we're investigating a whole range. We talked earlier about the potential seawall along Collingwood Beach and other places and how expensive it is. So we're looking at a lot of coastal zone management plans have a range of management options identified that are quite expensive, and currently there isn't a way, a mechanism to fund them to either the construction or the ongoing maintenance. So it's looking at a range of different funding options that might make these things a feasible management option. And the Stage 2 coastal reforms will be developed in consultation with the coastal expert panel that I mentioned earlier. So that's probably enough about legislation.